Well, it is top of the hour. So I would just like to thank Paula officially for coming in and doing this for our BVPPO section. Um, a little bit of the why behind why we are doing this. When the BVPPO Member Relations Committee sent out a survey last year, some of the feedback came back a lot about how there's not enough BVPPO representation at the academy meetings as far as lectures and workshops. And that is not something that the BVPPO leadership has any control over, but that is something that the lectures and workshops committee decides. And so Paula is just going to talk us through some of that and answer some questions. Thank you again for being here today.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer and Helen, for setting this up and for having me here. Like Jennifer said, just to give you a little more background, when I saw that there might be some concern, I am also a BVPPO member. So when I saw the results of that survey, I said, well, let's improve the transparency. Let's hopefully make this a better process for anybody applying for lectures and workshops, but also for us on the other side too, so that, expectations are nice and clear. This is meant to be fairly informal. I don't have any formal slides for you. I will kind of talk through the website a little bit and some of the information that's on there. I am also not giving any specific insider information. So this is meant to be very open. Like I said, hopefully improve transparency. So feel free, if you have some good little nuggets that you learned tonight or questions that you have answered that are your own or from colleagues, please feel free to share this information because we do want this to be a better process really for everybody. I will say, though, that I am just a representative of the committee. So if there's anything that I can't answer, I can take it back to the committee as a whole. Or if there are any bigger questions that come up, I'm happy to take that back to the committee so we can get you some more better information if needed. So jumping into the information that is currently available on the website, the Academy has done a really great job in updating some of the information that was there. I think, as we get some feedback, there's some new information. So in talking through the structure of our committee, the Lectures and Workshops Committee, first of all, I'll say is separate from a lot of the other education that goes on at the Academy meeting. So the Lectures and Workshops Committee were specifically responsible for the lectures, the rapid fires, the ACE courses, the workshops, and the grand rounds. And that's going to be completely separate from the scientific section, which is going to be all of the papers and posters, separate from the residency day programming, separate from the section symposium, and also separate from the diplomate prep course and any industry events that go on. So when we're thinking about what we're responsible for from the Lectures and Workshops Committee, that really is just limited to, the main grid that you think about: the lectures, the rapid fire lectures, the ACE courses, the workshops, and then the grand rounds. So I've listed through kind of what those different submissions are. And if you go to the website under education and then education submissions, it will pull up this page here about the Lectures and Workshops Committee and all of the information that we have here on the website. So as you go through that, you've got the different types of courses that you can submit for. This first page talks about the different course proposals that you can submit. As you scroll through the page, it goes through kind of general information at the top. And then if you keep scrolling, it will go through the different types of submissions that are available. So lectures are typically going to be those 1 or 2 hour lectures. It is stated right on the website here that 1 hour submissions are preferred. If you were thinking about sitting through these lectures as an attendee, I don't know about you, but for me, the further away I get from being a student, the harder it is to sit through 2 full hours of lecture. So we do prefer 1 hour submissions, both for attendees who prefer that 1 hour time slot to sit through, but also because it makes it easier to accept more submissions and because it makes it easier to kind of figure out where people need to go as we're looking through that final grid. When we are looking at a specific lecture, we typically don't like to see more than 4 people for a 1 hour lecture, just because more than that tends to be a lot of people where you're shifting back and forth, and then you're taking more time shifting between speakers rather than getting into the content of your lecture. If you hop down a couple bullets here for the lectures specifically, an outline of 1.5 pages per lecture hour is required. This is specific for the COPE requirements. So when you submit a lecture to the Academy, typically we will review that. We'll kind of figure out whether that's accepted or not accepted. And then that will get submitted to COPE. So that hour or that 1.5 page per lecture hour is something that COPE requires. So if you don't meet that 1.5 pages, COPE isn't going to approve it. And that adds a lot of back and forth time and a lot of revision of your outline that doesn't make the process quite as streamlined. We do accept 2-hour lectures, and those 2-hour lectures are typically the ones that are going to be designated as continuing education with examination. So certain states require that CEE designation. So if you do submit a 2-hour lecture, then we do like to see that you are have the ability to turn that into a CEE course so that we can use that for those individuals that do need that extra credit for their state licensure requirements. So I think everybody's pretty familiar with kind of the general lecture topic. The rapid fire courses are typically a longer lecture hour than a grand rounds presentation, and typically it will have kind of mini topics within one full hour of lecture. So in one full hour of lecture, you might have 3 or 4 speakers, and this is a really great opportunity for new speakers who maybe don't have the same, maybe don't have a lot of lecture experience or a lot of high-level lecture experience. This gives an opportunity to give a little piece of a topic without having to do a whole lecture on your own. So typically for these rapid fire, we'll have 3 or 4 speakers, either 16 minutes or 12 minutes per topic or per section of a topic. And then one person will submit with all of the CVs for that rapid fire presentation. The next type of submission that is fairly new within the last couple of years are the Academy Classroom Exchanges. The Academy Classroom Exchange, or the ACE courses, attendees do have to pay $25 per course, and these are limited to 36 attendees. These are really set up to be more of a small group discussion. So if there's a really unique topic, or if there's something that, you know, maybe has a better discussion format rather than a lecture format, you might want to consider an Academy Classroom Exchange or this ACE course so that you can get a little bit more one-on-one time or a little bit more discussion time for the attendees that are there in attendance. Workshops are typically some hands-on experience for the attendees, and these will also be typically an extra paid experience for the attendees, but you would submit your workshop in the same way that you would submit for any other lecture. We still need an hour and a half, or excuse me, 1.5 pages per lecture hour for the workshop. So within that workshop, you want to make sure that you are delivering good information, but also include that hands-on experience for attendees. And then the last section that we review is the grand rounds presentation. So I think everyone is familiar with what a grand rounds presentation is, but typically that is a singular case report or maybe a very short case series for a certain topic that can give really detailed information about an interesting case that you saw. So all of this information is on the website. If you go a little bit further down, there are notes about submission allowance. So it talks through, you know, we really as a committee and as an attendee like to see good variety in speakers, both within that year of the academy, but also year to year in the academy. So we do put a limit on the number of lectures that an individual is allowed to present at the academy meeting so that we don't just have, you know, 3 or 4 people that are presenting throughout the course of the meeting. We do like to have a lot of variety with our speakers, again, both to keep the lectures interesting, to keep the courses interesting, and to make sure that we have some variety in the speakers for the attendees that are there. Before I get into some kind of frequently asked questions, are there any big questions about the specific format of the lectures or different types of submissions that are available? I don't see anything in the chat and I don't hear anybody unmuting. Feel free to jump in if you do have a question. One of the biggest things, I'll kind of jump into frequent questions or things that you might not know about the submission process. I think the biggest thing to point out is that the process is very competitive. We typically receive around 620 submissions per year, but only select around 230 to 240 courses, which equals to about a 37 to 40% acceptance rate. And this was something that before I was on the committee, I really didn't understand the large volume of courses that are submitted every year. So like I said, around 230 to 240 that are accepted. This is based on what's available for the overall grid for our lecture space, based on the rooms that we have available during the meeting, which is all determined ahead of time by the academy. For 2023, we had 608 submissions and we ended up accepting 268 courses for 325 total hours. So some of those courses were 2-hour lectures. These are sorted by topic. So if you go to submit a lecture, or if you go to submit something for the Lectures and Workshops Committee, you'll see that there are different categories, and you're familiar with these from going to the Academy meetings. It might be general optometry, it might be public health, it might be functional vision. You can submit as one thing. Sometimes COPE will have us shift to a different topic just based on what's in that lecture outline. We do try to kind of stick to, whatever you submit, we try to stick to that, but sometimes COPE will have us shift that around. Jennifer, I see you've got your hand up.
Yes, it's actually on the topic you were just talking about. When I'm submitting lectures, I often struggle with what category to put it in because sometimes, yes, it makes sense, if I'm talking about strabismus to submit it under a pediatrics lecture. But when would it be beneficial to submit maybe under general optometry? Or if I'm doing a peds anterior segment, do
Right.
I submit that under pediatrics or anterior segment? And does it really matter though?
Great question. I will, the first part of the question I'll answer first. So what do you select? What do you put it under? It's really going to depend on the content of your lecture, and we really leave that up to you as the submitter. So when you are submitting that outline, you've got the information in that outline for what you want to present. It's going to be up to the person submitting as to whether that, if it's, let's say, a pediatric anterior segment lecture, is it really more focused on the specific pediatric aspects of that, or is it more maybe therapeutics where you're really focusing on the anterior seg, but it happens to be for pediatric patients because that's what you see in your practice? We recommend submitting whatever seems to fit best for you. But when we look at these reviews and when we're reviewing all of the information, we do talk between the tracks to figure out what has been submitted. So as we are reviewing, not everybody on the committee will review all 600 lectures, but usually we'll have 2 or 3 topics that we're reviewing. And when we have the, final figuring out of which courses are accepted and which courses are not accepted, we do make sure that, there's not a lot of overlap between tracks, and that, everything that is submitted here, it's not the same tract of all, let's say, anterior seg, peds disease in the peds track, and then anterior segment with the peds emphasis also in the anterior seg track. So we do pay attention to that as well. And we've got a variety of people with a variety of different expertises that are looking at all of these different categories. Katie, I see you've got your hand up. Just one more thought on this topic. The other thing we'll look at is who is the audience as you've written up your lecture. So if you are somebody that sees, referral only pediatric anterior segment, maybe that's going to be better as an anterior segment lecture. But if you're somebody that sees a lot of pediatrics and maybe you want to educate the practitioner who doesn't see a lot of pediatric patients but wants to learn more, then that might be more of a general optometry topic. So depending on the level of detail that you get into in your outline, might be a better fit for general optometry, or it might be a better fit for a more specialized specific category. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Katie Connolly, I see your hand up.
Yes, hello, good evening.
Hello.
I essentially have the question that you just answered, which was I've always kind of wondered whether or not I should write my outline in a way where it would be at the level in BVP specifically to where if I were speaking to, let's say, the audience that typically shows up at the PDIG meeting, these are people that are doing high level BVPs all the time. Should I be writing a lecture that would make them go, oh, okay, I hadn't thought about that before? Or should I lecture more to a broader optometry audience? And how that plays into when you guys are looking, what are you guys looking more for? Are you looking more for the broader audience, or are you looking for something to be really high level and specific?
This is a great segue into the next topic. So to very generally answer your question, when we review the courses, we are totally at the mercy of whatever is submitted. So in thinking about, how this course came about, if you feel like there haven't been enough lectures in the last couple of years, or you don't feel like you have seen a lot of courses on the grid that are really pediatrics for the primary care, the general optometrist, then you might want to think about doing something more in that area. But if you feel like, I have seen a lot of those basic courses, but I really want something that is more high level for, for the PEDS people, then you might think about writing that up at a higher level to be submitted, for that higher level course. I'm going to say it again, we are really at the mercy of whatever is submitted. We don't invite people specifically to lecture from the Lectures and Workshops Committee. There might be some of that for the section symposium or for some of the other areas, but for the Lectures and Workshops Committee, whatever is submitted is what we have to work with. So I would encourage you to kind of think about certainly where your areas of expertise are, but also think about, if you feel like there's something that's been missing for the past couple of years, maybe lean your lecture a little bit more in that area so that it has a better chance of being accepted. Does that answer your question, Katie? I know that's a very broad, maybe not as specific as you would like, but it's going to depend
No, that's
on
helpful.
what the topic is. Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions right now? Okay, not seeing any more hands and nothing else in the chat. So a couple of other things that I want to point out. Let me come back to my notes here. So we talked about the competitive nature of the process. I know I've heard colleagues tell me things like, oh, you can't get accepted unless you're a fellow, or you won't get accepted unless you've already applied like 4 or 5 times. That's really not the case. So I want to put some of those rumors to rest. We do try to have a very fair process, but because of that competitive nature and depending on what other people might be submitting, because we try to keep a good variety of lectures that are available in that final grid, we're only going to be able to accept, 1 or 2 lectures from each specific topic that's submitted. So to give an example, last year, I think we had a massive number of myopia control lectures that came through in the PED section, in the contact lens section, in the general optometry section. So we really had to kind of narrow down, okay, what are the top couple of lectures that we can put in this grid that are really going to be meaningful for attendees, that are also high level, that also have good outlines with speakers that are going to do a good job with the topic. So I would say, even if you've applied several years in a row and haven't got accepted, that doesn't mean that it wasn't a good submission. That doesn't mean that, there's anything about your CV necessarily that is excluding you from getting accepted for a lecture. But we are just at the mercy of whatever else is being submitted. Question came through in the chat, is it more difficult to have a workshop selected than a lecture? That is a good question. I don't know that I have a fantastic answer for that. I will say, I don't know the specific stats for the workshop specifically, but I know we have a higher number of lectures submitted than workshops. I can try to get an answer for that. And I thought I saw Josephine, are you still on the call?
I am. Hey, Paula.
Hi, yes, I hear you. Oh, there you are. I see you now. Josephine is also on the committee. Welcome, Josephine. Do you have an answer for the workshop question?
So let me see what the question was in the chat here. Trying to find it.
Is it more difficult to have a workshop selected than a lecture?
So not necessarily. So the answers that you gave for the lectures is the same type of answer that I would give for the workshop, meaning that whatever we have that is submitted is what we have to work with. That being said, though, if you know that there's something that you would want to see in terms of PEDS BV that should be submitted, that we should consider in workshops, I think you should go ahead and submit. Okay. Again, it's highly competitive. We look at it just like the lecture side, the workshop side is the same. And we go through them and we try to look at what would our attendees want to see. Another thing is if we have the same type of workshop submitted by multiple submitters, we would have to go for one to make sure that we're not leaving out other things, or two to make sure that we're not leaving out other sections. So that's why it seems as if it's difficult to get your workshops in. But again, it's highly, highly, highly competitive.
Thank you so much, Josephine.
Sure do.
All right, so looking at looking at kind of the overall evaluation, what are some of the things that we look at in order to have a successful submission? So first is going to be the topic that is submitted and the outline that is submitted. So we look for topics that are unique, certainly that are evidence-based, and that will hold some audience interest. And it's really tough to get more specific in that because what is unique every year is going to be a little bit different just depending on what's going on in the profession, what big research has come out, what types of things, clinicians are interested in, and the number of submissions that we get every year for a specific topic. So something that is, really unique and interesting one year, 3 years from now might not have that same uniqueness, might not have that same interest, might not have the same body of evidence that was present earlier. So it's really going to be a little bit variable year to year, depending on what types of things are unique and interesting to the audience that's there. But we do look at a really good detailed outline that is, that has a good amount of detail in that outline that shows that, number one, you've done your research. Number two, you have covered all of the bases for that topic that you're talking about. And to make sure that, it has that at least 1.5 pages per lecture hour that can be very easily submitted to COPE. We do look at previous experience lecturing. When you are submitting that CV and when you are cutting out, when you're trying to take your CV and cut it down to just that 3 or 4 pages that Academy is asking for, the biggest thing for the lectures and workshops committee is going to be that speaking experience that you have on there. So, even if you've done a lot of research, that's fantastic. And that's going to show that you're a content expert in whatever that area is that you're submitting for. But we also want to make sure that you are comfortable speaking in front of a large audience, and that you have some level of comfort doing that. If you have good national experience or large meeting experience, it's good to put that on there. But I will also say that we do also look for a certain amount of new speakers every year because, like I said, we don't want it just to be the same meeting with the same people lecturing every single year. So if maybe you haven't had a lot of very large meeting experience, but you have done some local experience or you've done some online lecturing and you have a video of that, the Academy is now allowing links to YouTube videos or video submissions that maybe if you don't have a long list on your CV of a lot of different lectures, you can submit that video so we can review that and you can show us that you got some comfort lecturing to groups of people on whatever your topic is. The other thing that we look for in the submission is we try to not have strongly biased lectures. So there is an area to disclose any conflicts of interest that you have. If you are working for a company or if you're closely tied to industry or if you have a certain product that has some type of conflict of interest, number one, we ask that you disclose that. But number two, we will look at the content to make sure that whatever it is that you're lecturing about doesn't have a strong bias towards that company that has that potential conflict. That's another thing that I've heard from people. Oh, I'm not allowed to submit for a lecture if I have some conflict. That's not necessarily true. We do just want that lecture to be as unbiased as possible, and we do want you to disclose any conflicts of interest that you might have. Questions at this point? Last piece I'll go into, and feel free to chime in if you do have a question. The very last piece that I want to talk about is for new speakers. So if you haven't been accepted before, or if you haven't done a lot of lecturing, what are some best practices that, that we recommend in order to make sure that you have a lecture that can get accepted? First of all, like I already said, those 1-hour submissions are going to be much more preferable to 2-hour submissions. 2 hours is a long time for a new speaker, especially if that speaker doesn't have a lot of large conference experience. So that 1 hour, again, it allows for a little bit more variety in the overall Academy schedule and is a little bit easier for attendees to sit through. Whether you're an experienced lecturer or not, that 1 hour is definitely going to be preferable to the 2-hour lectures. We do recommend thinking about those rapid fire formats. So if you have a colleague or if you have a friend or if you have somebody that you work with who has done a lot of Academy speaking, that's a fantastic collaboration in which you as a new speaker and your established speaker colleague can work together to have, you get some of that new speaking experience but you've also got the background of your established colleague who, you know, if there are big spaces or if there is some blank time or if things go too fast or too slow, that experienced speaker is going to be able to kind of jump in and help adjust that so that you get that 50 minutes of lecture time. Attendees generally tend to like that fast pace of that rapid fire too, because it is, you know, short topics, it's different people presenting, it keeps it really interesting after a very long day of sitting in academy lectures. Be thoughtful about the topic that you're submitting. If you are submitting on something where there are likely going to be a lot of other topic submissions, think about what is going to make your submission unique, or what information are you presenting, what research are you presenting that might be a little bit unique or a little bit different or a little bit niche compared to those other submissions for that same category topic. I've talked about it before, I'll talk about it again. We do like to have really clear outlines. If you can include some references in your outline, that is helpful. And we like them to have a clinical value. So most of the people that come to Academy are clinicians, right? They're working in a clinic all day, every day. Certainly we have a high number of academics and researchers and other career paths, but the vast majority of attendees are in a clinic seeing patients. So we do like to see a little bit of a clinical emphasis. If you've done a lot of research and you think, man, I've got this really great research that I want to present, that might be a better submission for the scientific section rather than the lectures and workshops committee. But having some scientific presentations, we will also look at that when we're looking through the CV. So maybe if you've done a lot for the scientific program, but not as much for lectures and workshops, that will still definitely count as experience, especially if you have several papers that have been reviewed. Oops, sorry, I think I missed a couple things in the chat. I see one question in here. First one on the list, is it harder to do an ACE session, and is it better to have a team approach versus a solo presenter? I'm not sure if that question about the team approach versus solo presenter is for an ACE course. I would say if you're a brand new speaker and if it's your first time submitting for Academy, if the first time you're thinking about lecturing to Academy, we definitely recommend that team approach rather than the solo approach for a new lecturer. But the rest of it is just really going to depend on what your topic is, what both speakers' expertise is on that topic, and whether or not those speakers have spoken before at a national meeting. For the ACE session, I don't know that it's necessarily easier or harder. We do like to see in the ACE sessions that you are including the attendees in some way. So like I said before, the ACE sessions are meant to be more like a small group discussion with the expert that is there to answer questions and maybe direct some conversation. So depending on, you know, what your style of lecturing is, what you're most comfortable with, if you prefer the small groups and a little bit more discussion based, then maybe think about doing an ACE session rather than a full normal program lecture. Another question, is there a maximum length for an outline? That's a good question. There is not necessarily a maximum length, but we do look at, is all of the content that you provide in your outline something that you are reasonably going to be able to get through in the amount of time that you submitted for? So if you're submitting for a 1-hour lecture, but you provide 16 pages of outline, it's probably not reasonable that you're going to get to every single one of those pieces of information within that 1-hour time slot. So we recommend at least 1.5 pages. I would say most of the ones that we review are a little bit longer than that for a good detailed outline, but we don't necessarily have a maximum length. The other thing that I'll say as far as the outline is that sometimes people will present, you know, the physical outline, just a Word document in words, but sometimes people will present their actual slide deck as well. So if you have either one of those, if you have a lecture that's developed, we do like it to be, you know, as up to date as possible. But if you have a slide deck rather than a specific word by word, 1.5 pages, you know, written out outline, that is also an acceptable submission. Another question, do you look at location for the conference and get local non-OD experts to participate? This is a really good question and brings up a topic that I don't think I've touched on yet. So we don't necessarily look at the location for the conference for local non-OD experts, but we do strongly encourage interprofessional education. So if you've gone to previous meetings and you look at the grids, you'll see that there are some that have you know, maybe an ophthalmologist that works with an optometrist and they will lecture together. I've been to some that are like a child development specialist that is also working with an optometrist. So depending on what your topic is on, you might have somebody that you work closely with or that you have talked to about different ideas. And we do definitely encourage interprofessional education because that gives certainly a different aspect of the care that we provide every day, day to day as optometrists. I hope that answers your question. I'm going to move on to the next one that's in the chat. Is there a character limit for outline submissions? There might have been some confusion between the grand rounds and the word limit not being listed in the application software. I would have to look at that. I believe, in thinking about this off the top of my head, I believe there's a character limit. I know for sure there's a character limit and limits for the scientific section. I don't think that there is a character limit for the outline submissions because most of those are attached as PDFs or as Word documents. So that might be specific to the grand rounds. I can look into that and get back to you. But for the lectures and workshops, for your normal lectures, for your rapid fire, I don't believe there is a word limit or a character limit because typically you're going to upload your outline rather than fill in the blanks. I think that answers most of the questions that popped up in the chat, but feel free to put more in there if anything else comes up. Back to the new speakers, best recommendations for new speakers. We talked about the outline. We talked about the number of new speakers. So we do keep track of the new speakers that are in the meeting. Like I said before, we like to have a good variety of speakers year to year and within the meeting itself within 1 year. The other thing I was going to say about the oh, I lost it. New speakers. I had a thought, I'll come back to it. We do recommend grand rounds for new speakers, which is a really great way to kind of practice talking in front of an audience, get that submission in and give some preliminary information before you have something accepted to as a regular lecture for the full meeting. Is it allowable to submit for a workshop including non-ODs, such as an OD and OT team? Yes, absolutely. We do see submissions every once in a while. So, you know, if you had something that was very OT being occupational therapy, very occupational therapy specific, and you want to talk about, you know, the optometric implications of that, or if you have some idea with an OT that you work with, you can definitely absolutely submit with that OT as a co-author, and then that would count as an interprofessional piece of education for that final grid. Oh, I remember. So the other thing I was going to say for not so much for new speakers, but really for established speakers, and in thinking about the variety of the lectures and keeping a new and interesting and exciting program every year, we do like to see updated lectures when you submit. So if you have been submitting the same, you know, the same lecture and you've given the same lecture 2 years in a row, we do look as a committee at how often you've given that same lecture before. And if we see that you've lectured, you know, 2 or 3 years in a row on the exact same topic and there have been no updates to the topic that you're submitting, there's a good chance that that won't get accepted in the interest of keeping things interesting for the people that are attending them. So again, I do just want to highlight that it is a very competitive project, competitive process. We do try to be very objective in looking at the submissions and evaluating the submissions and having multiple people review each submission, so that when we come out with that final grid, it is something that has some variety, that has some high-level lectures, but also some lectures that are available to the general practicing optometrist, and that has topics that are going to be timely and evidence-based, and just some good variety of interest. I think that covers all of the main talking points. I've got one more question in the chat here. If you developed a presentation, you can send the PowerPoint deck in place of a written outline. That is correct. We do look at if you are sending the PowerPoint rather than the specific outline, again, just make sure that all of the information that you have in there is up to date. If it's a lecture that you put together 5 years ago, and there's new research in that area, that might not get evaluated quite as highly as somebody that has that same topic with the most up-to-date information, that has that information in there. So again, in thinking about whether you're sending in an outline or whether you're sending a slide deck, just keep in mind that we are looking at those both to evaluate your lecture, but then also for COPE approval. So it has to be something that's going to be usable for COPE approval. Okay, that's a lot of information. Any other questions that I can answer at this point, or anything that hasn't been addressed, maybe that came up in thinking about representation specifically from the BVPPO section? Like I said, feel free if there's any, tips that you picked up on today that you thought were really great, please feel free to share these with your colleagues. There isn't, nothing secret in this. Most of the information is on the website. If you have specific questions, feel free to send me an email. My email is just paulamcdowell@ferris.edu. If it's something that I can answer, I'm happy to answer it. If it's something that I can't answer, I will find somebody that can and get back to you to the best of my ability.
Thank you, Paula, for the transparency. I think this is very helpful for everybody. Yeah, this is great.
Great. Anything else that you have questions about, or anything that came up in the survey, Jennifer, that?
No, nothing specific, just,
Um,
I think a lot of questions about how this process is done. And I think you answered that question tonight.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everyone. Thanks for jumping on. I appreciate your attendance. And like I said, if there's anything that you think of, feel free to send me an email. I'd be happy to answer it.